that combined, and they developed a scenario. But they said, well, what if we had drought in some major producing countries? What if we had conflict that disrupted trade in this region? What if we had a number of kinds of things which all have happened at different times in the recent past, but what if they all happened at the same time? And they, as an insurance group, are concerned about what would that do to our business? What kind of liability, how many billions of dollars would we be liable for to our different parties that insure with us in different parts of the world? So they developed a scenario. We did some analysis for them and said, well, here's the range of possible price impacts that you might see. And they took those impacts then and put them into their own models about what that might do for their insurance liability. But it's just another example of the types of interest that private sector, in addition to public sector, can have in this sort of long-term projections work. And as I said, we do that to inform decisions. It could be national partners, regional, international. At the CGIAR level, it could be of use in a center, thinking about planning and prioritizing research in different areas, whether it's different types of technologies or in different regions of the world. It could be at the CRP level. It could be at the CGIAR system level, and I put a question mark there, because partly it's a question of technical issues and research questions, but it's also, importantly, when you talk about prioritization, it's a question about institutional relationships as well. And since there's so much uncertainty in the reform of the CG system right now and the governance process and so forth, we would love to be able to inform that process, but it's not just a matter of producing results and expecting someone to pick them up. It's a longer term dialogue process. But I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. So just a few examples here of analysis that we did with 4 other global economic modeling groups to look at broad trends. In this case, in the impacts of socioeconomic drivers, and I mentioned population and income being the ones that we look at in this analysis. And we looked at that so the 5 global economic models, IFPRI's impact model and 4 others, looking at these 5 commodity groups, coarse grains, rice, wheat, oilseeds, and sugar, under 3 different socioeconomic assumptions. The middle of the road one, SSP2 that I mentioned, SSP1, which is, you could call it more optimistic, but very briefly what it assumes is slower population growth and improvements in productivity through sustainable technologies. Whereas SSP3 has higher population growth and slower economic growth. But you see, in terms of these are comparisons, percentage differences from today to 2050. So on average for these commodity groups, increases in yields globally of about 50 to 60%. Small increases in area, about 5 to 8%. And that continues historic patterns over the past half century. We've seen that most production increases are coming from increases in yield rather than area. Across the scenarios, very similar projections for increase in total production and total consumption, about 70%. And that's close to what the FAO also has projected using a very different methodology. So that gives us some confidence that this group of models is moving in the right direction. Increases in prices, increases in trade, and so forth. But these are the socioeconomic drivers. Then we can also look at what climate change would do to those. Now this set here are percentage changes relative today. This set are percentage differences compared to that set that I just showed you. So in 2050, we've already built in the impacts of population growth and income change and so forth. But relative to that, then if we impose what happens with climate change, and this is obviously a very abbreviated summary, but we would see reductions in yields on average. This is globally for these commodity groups. Increases in area. So this relative, you recall that the yield increases were on the order of 50%, and here we see 5 to 7% decreases, depending on what we assume about socioeconomic and the level of climate change. Area doesn't look like that large an increase, it's about 4%, but in fact it's about double the increase that we already saw related to population and income growth. So that's potentially a big impact on things like land use, biodiversity, water quality, and so forth, environmental issues. Very little on production, just because that's driven heavily by socioeconomic patterns that drive demand, and that's a very powerful force. Prices increased by 15%, and again, that about doubles the increase that we were already expecting based on socioeconomic. And that has important implications. Even if average production and consumption doesn't change much, those increases in prices have the potential to have important food security impacts. So just some examples of global analyses. And now I'd like to look a little bit more in detail on some specific results on different variables coming from the impact model. The previous one, as I mentioned, involved 5 different models working together. This is just the impact model results. And it's important to note here that the projections I'll show are not the world as we think it should be. It's not a normative statement. It's not even the world as we think it will be. It's not a forecast. But it's a projection if we make certain assumptions about how population will change, how income change, how climate will change, and so forth. So I'll go through some examples of that. One big factor that we'll see change in is in the consumption side, composition of diets. So this shows for different regions, world, East Asia, Pacific, North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, at 3 different time periods, 2010, 2030, 2050. The consumption, this is per capita calories here, and how much of those come from different food groups. So at the bottom are the staples, orange are cereals, purple roots and tubers. And across the board you see, in most cases, those are steady, maybe declining a bit. In some cases they're increasing, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, former Soviet Union. I'm not quite sure why we would see those increases in Europe, but there is some increase there. But larger increases in these other commodity areas. The yellow in particular, oils and sugar, the things that we all like to eat. Those are becoming a more significant part of the diet in several parts of the world. And also some of the higher values. So some of those could be expected to have adverse impacts on non-communicable diseases. But others could have positive effects, increased consumption of fruits and vegetables, which also tends to come with higher incomes. So another important thing to note is that these increases over here, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, may not seem that significant when we look across because they aren't the highest in level in per capita terms. But with the population growth that we expect in these 2 regions, those will add up to big changes. And particularly if we look at fruits and vegetables, animal products, it's hard to see there, but there are, in percentage terms, quite substantial increases there, which will have implications for demand for cereals for feed purposes as well. So if we aggregate that and look totally, globally at demand for major food groups, we see the fastest growth. These are index values. So today is 1, 2050 would be the value here. Oilseeds growing the fastest. Cereals and roots and tubers and staple crops growing, but not as fast as the others in intermediate cases. If we break it down and focus just on cereals, the fastest growth we expect is for maize, and growth, but at slower rates for rice and for wheat. And that difference for maize comes from the fact that a large share of the demand, this is by region, East Asia, Pacific, South Asia, and so forth, breaks it down for different categories. So in this case, blue is direct consumption for food, orange is for feed, and then other sources of demand. So the bulk, no surprise, the bulk of maize demand composition is coming from other demand, and especially feed. And in the case of North America, an increasing share going also to biofuels. That's a very different story than for rice, where the bulk of it is for direct food consumption. And we see the highest levels in East Asia and the Pacific, again in total demand for a region in 2010 and 2050. So the levels are highest in East Asia and Pacific, not a lot of change in aggregate or in percentage terms. The largest change in absolute terms is in South Asia, between 2010 and 2050. And interesting, the largest change in percentage terms is here in Sub-Saharan Africa, more than doubling in total demand for rice in that region. And I should say all of these results that I've showed so far, they assume the middle-of-the-road socioeconomic scenario and no climate change yet. I'll introduce climate change in a moment. So where will that demand come from? How will we meet that demand? Here's one way of looking at the sources of growth in global production. This is for cereals. So on the horizontal axis here we have changes in area, and on the vertical axis, changes in yield. And again, these are index values compared to 2010 being 1. So let's look at the case of maize here, the biggest one. The size of that circle corresponds to the increased annual production. In the case of maize, about 500 million tons per year that we project will be the increase in production in 2050 relative to today's values. But the position of that circle is also important. So from the center of that circle dropping down, that corresponds to 1.2, 1.25. That means a 20 or 25% increase in harvested area by 2050 in the case of maize. And correspondingly, about a 40% increase in yields, average globally, in the case of rice. So different crops are in different positions here. Rice being here, not much change in area anticipated, about a 25% increase in yield under this particular scenario. What's interesting is they're all above this 45-degree line. What that means is the growth in production is coming more from increased yields than it is from increased areas. And again, that's a continuation of what we've seen in previous decades. It's not true for all commodities. Oilseeds are closer to the line here. Soybeans are somewhere over here. Palm oil is way out here. So some increases in yields, but quite significant increases in area. So it depends on the commodity. We can break that down by region. This is the same set of cereals globally and in different parts of the world, just to show, for example, in Africa, there's a tendency for things to be a little bit more reliant on increases in area than in yield, not a surprise. And we can also break down a specific commodity for different producers. So here's rice in Asia, South Asia on the left, East Asia, and Pacific over on the right. But the same things on the axes. This for India corresponds to about a 25 million metric ton increase in production of rice. Again, very little increase in area, and that's true for Nepal and Sri Lanka as well. A little bit more apparent increase in area in Bangladesh and Pakistan, but different degrees of yield increase. And likewise for East Asia and Pacific over here. So just some examples, again, before we incorporate climate change, about how we could anticipate increases in production in different parts of the world. But climate change is already happening. What kind of impact do we expect that's going to have over time? So far we've been focusing over here on the economic modeling side. But to introduce climate change, we have to then bring in, obviously, results from climate models, and we have to feed those through crop models in order to get, so we take the change in temperature and precipitation and solar radiation and so forth out of the general circulation models. Those go into crop models, which generate a change in yield, which then can be fed into impact or into another global economic model. And the difference is we get a yield outcome here eventually. The difference from this one is that also reflects other adjustments. This initial shock, if we saw a 10% reduction in yields due to changes in precipitation, for example, we would expect that change in yield and production would have changes in the market. Prices would go up, farmers would have an incentive perhaps to switch some land from other crops into rice, or if the land stays the same, perhaps to apply fertilizer more intensively, or to weed more carefully, or to change a planting date, or something like that. So there will be responses. And we try and capture those in the model so that the ultimate yield impact is not necessarily the same one as that we see coming out of the crop model. So I'll give an example of that. And I actually hesitate to show this because I suspect many of you in the room know more about crop models than I do, and I'm sure that all of you know more about rice than I do. But just as an example, these are results from DSAT simulation. So this is the series rice model for one particular set of assumptions. So it's in 2050. It's using the HADGEM general circulation model. It's assuming a high emissions pathway. And the point is to show that obviously there are wide variation in impacts. There is no answer to what is the impact of climate change on rice yields. There are thousands of different answers depending on, is it rain-fed? Is it irrigated? Do we include CO2 fertilization or not? And this is just for one set of models, one set of assumptions, one time period. These are going to change over different time periods. They'll be different for IRRI than they were for DSAT. That's the importance of having a tool that allows you to put in different models. If you're not happy with these particular assumptions, or you're interested in 2030 or 2070, you can change the parameters of the model and run something differently. But the other important thing here, this is before economic responses. So this is coming out of the crop model, but it's not yet the final impact that we would project. Here's a summary slide for that. This is by region, world, East Asia, Pacific, and so forth, but for cereals as an aggregate in 2050 under different assumptions about climate change. So all of these have the SSP2 assumption, but they range from low to high emissions pathways. So for any region, the gray bar represents the increase in yields that we would project independent of climate change. This is based on socioeconomic change and technology and so forth. So in the case of former Soviet Union, about a 50% increase in cereal yields overall. But with climate change, they would actually be quite happy. They would see longer growing seasons and so forth, potentially higher yields there. Quite a different story in North America, South Asia, where depending on the degree of climate change, you would have slight, moderate to quite significant yield losses. Let's break that down, and we can compare then the same graph for different cereals. This is the case for maize. You can see almost across the board fairly significant potential losses due to climate change, particularly as it gets more severe by 2050. Not so much in the case of wheat. Again, there are gains in some areas, slight gains at the world level, losses in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And then for rice, yet another story. Globally, it's about a neutral impact, but particularly in North America and South Asia, we see potential losses there. Interestingly, in East Asia and Pacific, not much change. We interpret that to mean that there's enough diversity in crop growing regions, latitude, and so forth, that in some cases there will be losses, in some cases will be gains. But again, we would love to have your input on this. We're doing this with the tools we have, but we could do a better job learning from you about what you think and what comes out of ERISA and out of the scenarios that you may have done. So these are all, as I suggested, they're continual works in progress. We're always looking to improve and to take feedback from people who know more about particular crops and about particular regions. We can look at impacts on prices. These are the impacts of changes in population income. So these are the different SSPs that I introduced. SSP2 is the heavy blue line in the middle in some cases, and that results in increases in real prices for cereals globally of about 20% over this time period. But those could be as much as half again as high under some socioeconomic scenarios, or quite a bit lower under others. In the case of climate change, they're always up. There are always increases. Because at the global level, the impact on yields is negative, and with demand and consumption increasing, then that puts pressure on prices. This is just an example of RCP 8.5 showing a range of different general circulation models, just to show the band of uncertainty. We've used, in this case, I think 4 different GCMs, but talking with Tao and Tree yesterday, I guess there are 20 or more GCMs that are used globally. And our goal is not to use all of them. We just want to get a sense of the diversity. And in addition to differences in global averages, they have very significant differences in some regions. Some cases show South Asia gaining in terms of precipitation, and others show it quite becoming significantly drier. So it's important to have a range of tools there just to get a sense of the diversity there. Differences in prices and production, we expect changes in trade between countries and regions as well. So the same set of regions here, these are changes in net trade. So where it's positive, then a country is on net an exporter, and negative on net an importer. So look at North America here. The gray bar represents what we expect, or what we have today, just current values. So North America being a net exporter on the order of about 100 million tons per year. The little black bar here is what we would expect in 2050 without climate change. So without climate change, we would expect North America to more than double its exports. But that will be reduced by climate change because North America and many of the climate models tends to get quite a bit drier in the major grain producing areas. In other regions, there may be, there are in most cases significant changes due to socioeconomic conditions, but not always significant changes in climate. And again, that's because there are diverse experiences within those regions. If we zero in on rice, there's an interesting picture here. Well, let's look at South Asia first, because that shows the most significant adverse impacts. Not much of either an exporter or importer at the moment on net, but we expect it to become a net importer on average, about 10 million tons per year. But that could grow quite a bit more because of climate change. And I should say here too, we've only estimated or incorporated a subset of possible climate impacts, and those are the ways in which temperature and precipitation and so forth affect crop productivity. We haven't incorporated sea level change, we haven't incorporated melting of glaciers and loss of irrigation capacity, for example, in South Asia. So some of those drivers adding on to this could make the story quite different. That's South Asia. East Asia and Pacific, quite a different story. A small net exporter at the moment, projecting that to increase, and it could actually increase even further as a result of climate change. Again, it's based on differences in production systems within that region. Obviously, it spans a wide range of latitudes from tropical to temperate, and those will have different implications from climate change. Now, one thing that we're very interested in, and I think this is about the last set of results I'll show, what does this all mean for food security? And one measure of that is population at risk of hunger. This more or less corresponds to the FAO's numbers of undernourished people in the world, which is currently 800 and some million. If we break it down by region, the gray bar, where we are today, the blue bar, where we would expect to be in 2050 without climate change, but then with climate change, we see some of those gains reversed, and most notably in sub-Saharan Africa. On total here, about 50 million people are likely to be at risk of hunger under climate change who would not otherwise be in 2050. So, as I said, this is not the world as we think it should be, but given the assumptions that I've mentioned here, what we think is a likely outcome under those conditions. But there are things that we can do to change that. Some of those things have to do with national policy or international agreements. That's beyond what the CG's major source of influence is, but some of them are things that CG research can influence, particularly new technologies that can affect crop yields. It might be new varieties, it might be different production practices, water harvesting, irrigation, precision agriculture, and so forth. I won't go into detail on these, other than just to show that these are examples that we work on with the different centers and then trace through the models to see what they have in terms of impact on variables that we know that we're concerned about, the national policy makers are concerned about, the donors are concerned about, and these are the types of indicators that they want to know. How does your work make a difference ultimately? And we have to trace it through a lot of complicated relationships. So at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Sam for a minute and say a little bit about what IRRI in particular is doing on Global Futures.
That's fine. You can
leave it to him.
Maybe I can use that.
Sure.
Thank you, Kif. What I'm going to do in the next few minutes just to talk to you on our involvement in the project. It is one of the first 4 CG centers started interacting with Global Futures in 2008. I think it's IRRI, IFPRI, CIMMYT, ICRISAT, and ILRI. So we're one of the first centers started this collaboration. Then we dropped off the project because our management decided not to participate in PIN in 2010. So we are out from 2010 to end of 2013. So we are gone. And during that time, your partnership expanded into all the other city centers, whereas IRRI didn't participate because of our decision. Then we joined back again in 2014, actually, for the last 2 years. So our relationship is on and off, but I think it's going very well now. Management decided to actively participate in other CRPs, so we are back on track. I'll just tell you who are involved in the project. I've been leading that project for last few years, but Tri is taking more of a lead now. So hopefully he will be the one leading in the future. So it's Tauli, Murthy. We have a new postdoc joining next week, Subir from Bangladesh. So he'll be doing a lot of economic modeling along with, in partnership with Kip and his group. Then we also have people from other disciplines, particularly people from the CEST and breeding people involved in providing a lot of feedback. For example, Paul Quick is directly involved with Murthy and Tao in modeling Taoli, not modeling Taoli. Of course you can.
It's impossible.
That's probably one thing you should try next month. Modeling C4 ice. So I'm going to tell you the results. Then Arvind has been involved with ex-ante assessment of drought tolerant varieties there. This is some of the output we have. One of the biggest output, I would say. Remember when Keith talked about, he only talked about DSAT, where Oriza was not part of DSAT when the analysis was done. Right now, Oriza 3, that has been part of DSAT platform. So any users can decide to use AppSim, DSAT, or any other rice model, depending on the preference and other things they are doing. Then we also have a C4 rice version of Oriza available within DSAT. Right now it's available only for 3 partners, IFPRI, us and the Florida, but eventually it will be available to the wider group of researchers. Then we are also looking at developing a lot of different modules into Oriza, particularly submergence, drought and heat. So a lot of activities have been sponsored, particularly the crop modeling improvement has been sponsored by Global Futures, IFPRI and PIM. So that's one of the biggest contributions probably IFPRI or PIM had in the last few years to IRRI. This is an example of drought tolerant, when we did the ex-ante assessment of drought tolerant varieties. We only focused on South Asia there. This talks about the yield gains under different climate scenario if a drought varieties was introduced in 2015, just like Keith was talking about different climate scenario there. So you can see the yield gains of actually nearly 10 to 15% in terms of across the region there. Then we feed that yield change just like impact, but at that time we only used our small rice model there to look at the impact of introducing drought tolerant varieties. This is your 2012, but we looked at the impact in 2035. This is your baseline. So if your drought tolerant variety introduced in 2015, by 2035 we would have 12 million tons higher yield in South Asia because of drought tolerant varieties. So these results are fed back into a welfare model to look at the producer surplus, consumer surplus. Actually, this is now accepted in this mitigation adoption strategy to global change. So it will be published in 2016 this year. Then recently we have been working for last about a year and a half. Murthy and Tao both working with Paul Quick, kind of modeling C4 rice in Oriza. It was not available, so we introduced a new module into the Oriza. These are the initial results both for South Asia, Southeast Asia, but I'm just presenting to South Asia. It's just interesting because this is your C3 rice yield in 2035-39 under one climate scenario, isn't it? Then you can see the yields in 3.5 to 5, 5 to 7, most of the things. But if we have a C4 rice available by 2035, you can see the jump in the yield going from 3 ton to 5 ton. So nearly 25 to 50% gain in yield. So in both South Asia and Southeast Asia there. So we are looking at big change in terms of the productivity if C4 rice is available globally there. So our next step is to feed this model into impact, because I would like to feed that into impact because you need a multi-commodity model. Because if we have 50% increase in yield, we are looking at millions of hectares coming out of rice. Millions, maybe 20, 30 million hectares. So we need a multi-commodity to see where this rice area is going to go. And whether it's going to go to fallow or what's the environmental impact of that, methane emission, those type of things. So the next thing is to feed back into the impact model to look at the change in the cropping systems, change in the welfare, in the poverty alleviation, those type. I think it will be very interesting to do it, and that's our plan to do it in 2016. These are some of the ongoing activities. As I mentioned, we would like to do the ex-ante impact assessment, feeding those yield changes into the impact under different weather scenarios there, just like Keith mentioned. So we hope to achieve that this year. Then also we have worked on different other different activities with Global Futures Group. A lot of baseline data, cropping calendars. Then we are also developing a convergence module in Horizon there. So there are a lot of crop modeling activities ongoing within this project. We don't have an economist, so we are, as I said, we are getting a postdoc who will be interacting with kids group in terms of converting those yield changes into the welfare changes or surplus changes there. So you'll see a lot more output in 2016-17 coming out of this project there. That's all.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Sam. Just a couple more slides to close up, and then we can have some time for questions. As I mentioned before, we want this to be useful for decision making. And focusing now particularly on the CGIAR Center, we're all going through the process of 2016 work planning. I don't know, maybe IRRI's ahead of us. At IFPRI, we're still doing it for this year, but some centers are already finished. Likewise, though, the phase 2 proposals for the CRPs, I'm very much involved in the PIM planning. I know you guys are very much involved in the RICE CRP planning. What we've been talking about with Sam and with Bas Baumann and others, we really want to make sure that those plans are coordinated, because we can both benefit from what the others are doing, and also because the donors want to make sure that these types of activities are not going on in an unrelated manner. So that's something that is important for us at the moment. And as I said, at the system level, there's a change in the governance structure going on this year. So it's a difficult time for the system as a whole to plan and set priorities, because that's obviously always a tricky and a sensitive issue. But even if we don't manage to achieve that type of impact this year, we want to do, as I said earlier, not just to produce one set of results and say, okay, we are comfortable with the answers, our job is finished, but to build the capacity, because the questions will continue to change over time. We would like you and our other partners with us to be able to continue looking at new scenarios as new questions and new challenges and new opportunities arise. ISBC has indicated quite a strong interest in this type of work, and so whatever results that we do have, that we are producing, we're going to make sure and share with them so that they can use those as they would like as well. You've probably all seen this. In terms of what the types of things are that this approach can inform, you may not be able to read. Increased productivity. There are some of these that we're better equipped to deal with, impacts of climate change and so forth. Some of them that we're less well equipped. Incomes and employment, improved food safety. There are a lot of things here that just are beyond the capacity of this model. And we don't want to claim that we can answer all of these questions, just that we're one part of, one source of information for all of that. Having said that, we are working to improve in different areas, better treatment of livestock and fish, excuse me, eventually gender, poverty, environmental impacts, and so forth. So I'll conclude with that just by saying we do have an opportunity to inform decision making. Part of the value of that is that this spans all of the centers working together and therefore can draw on a really rich and diverse set of experience. It's important to remember that this can be done at different scales of analysis. This project started out with a very narrow focus on specific technologies, but we really are finding there's a lot of interest beyond that in what are the broader drivers, what is the context of, what is the demand for rice going to look like 10, 20 years from now? And as Sam said, what if we have major technological breakthroughs? What impact will that have on land use or on the production of other crops? So because those questions and challenges keep changing, that's why we want to continue to build and strengthen a community of practice to continue doing this type of analysis over time. And in doing that, we look forward to our continued collaboration with IRRI. So thank you very much.
We'll open it out for question and answer. We still have 10 minutes. The question from definitely
Are all the CG centers producing technologies? Because from what I hear, it's IRRI, CIMMET, and I don't know what else. And then in your assumptions, do you assume that the CGIAR will still be alive?
Maybe that's a scenario. Without CGIAR.
That's a scenario. There were two questions. Are all the centers working on new technologies? And yes, I mean, different types of technologies. Some of them are new crop varieties, and some of them are new management practices. You know, IMI is more on the water management side as opposed to crop varieties and so forth. So, but in one way or another, yes, they're all working on their particular mandate, regions, crops, commodities, technologies. As to whether the CG Center, that's, as Sam said, that's a scenario we wouldn't want to predict. But interestingly, so USAID, one of our donors, has asked us to do some scenarios. They didn't ask us to do a scenario without the CGIAR, but they did say, we're making a lot of decisions about supporting agricultural research. Could you do some scenarios that assume different levels of investment? And so one of those scenarios, we're still, you know, we haven't, even defining the scenario is a challenge in itself, but we're talking with Sam and the others to figure out what would be useful scenarios. And so one thing that we will probably do is to say, well, let's continue that, assume that CGIAR funding continues at the level, and I think, I forget what the amount is. It's $1 billion, 900 million, something like that. What if that is the case? And what if it increases by 20%, 30%? I don't know. And what if it decreases by 20 or 30%? We won't go all the way to zero. We don't want to attempt fate there. But yes, that's an important type of question, because obviously we believe we're having an impact. We want the donors to understand that, and I think they do. But to come up with a precise estimate is tricky. Thank you.
Can you go back to the earlier slides on showing the SSP 1, 2, 3 under climate change? I think the first two slides.
This one? Or
This
this one?
This one.
Mm-hmm.
You say the SSP1 is under kind of optimistic scenario. The technology is making a better progress. But looking at this, it looks like that's showing, is it right that we interpret is that is actually the one impacted by the climate change more?
Okay.
And if that's the case, does it mean that current technology is not addressing climate change? Does that mean room for improvement for the climate change research? I don't know.
Let me try and clarify. So there are actually two things that are changing in each of these scenarios. There's a difference in the SSP. So this is SSP1, SSP2, and SSP3. And along with those, we just made an assumption that there would be a different rate of climate change as well. So with SSP1, we assumed a slow growth in emissions, RCP 4.5. With SSP3, we assumed a high emissions pathway, 8.5, and then an intermediate case for SSP2. So in this case, and the lightest orange is the first scenario, SSP1 with slow emissions increase. That would show a decrease in yields of about 5%. And then, in fact, SSP2 doesn't show up here because it's essentially the same as the SSP3 case. With the pessimistic socioeconomic scenario and the faster climate change, then you would have a greater reduction in yields. So I think that is consistent with the intuition. But unless you are seeing something else here that you'd like.
I think that's correct.
Okay.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. There's one slide where you showed trade also from rice.
Mm-hmm.
And what we saw was the trade in, I think, Southeast Asia, or Pacific and Africa would dramatically increase. Is this for all commodities, or is it specific to rice that you expect, like the black bar is significantly higher than what is being traded right now?
So which particular region?
Both in the first one, East Asia and Pacific,
Okay.
and in Africa.
Yeah. Well, so if you ignore the colored dots and just look at the gray bar and the black, the gray column and the black bar, yes. Without climate change, here we are today, and we would project an increase in net exports of rice
Yeah.
from East Asia Pacific, and an increase in net imports for South Asia.
Yeah, so does it mean that no matter what climate change or not, trade and more quality in rice will become more important, and trade between countries, trade between continents?
Mm-hmm. Well, I
Or
can't
is
say
this
I can't
general
say
for
anything.
all commodities?
I can't say anything about the quality dimension. That would be an important thing to explore. But independent of the quality, just looking at rice overall, yes. I mean, in pretty much every case, you see that the little black bar is farther away than the gray column. So we do see an increase in trade, just based on socioeconomic projections. And then in a couple of important cases, we see that that will be magnified by climate change.
Keith, I think related to what Peter asked, South Asia, but you didn't mention South Asia.
Mm-hmm.
South Asia right now is the largest exporter of grains.
Yeah.
They export actually 35 million tons of grains in both India and Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
So you think there's a complete changes from 35 million to?
Well, so you're talking about cereals overall?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is just
Even rice also. Rice also now South Asia exports 15 million tons. So nearly 40% of the world trade now comes out of India and Pakistan.
okay. Well, these should be coming from FAUSTAT data.
Yeah, that's. I'm
but-
thinking 2010 that was the situation.
Okay.
But now it has changed quite a
Okay.
bit.
Yeah. Well, so that will change from year to year, and obviously, and we want to update our base year as well, so
Yeah.
that we can capture those.
Because
kinds of things.
2010 there was a export ban
Mhm.
from India,
Mhm.
so they were not exporting. Now they are the largest exporter in the world. India is.
Okay.
India exporting now 30 million tons of grains, rice, wheat, corn, everything they're exporting now.
Mhm.
Well, it's 2010 they were not present there.
Yeah.
Well,
One thing that really struck me of the scenario on the specific region, particularly on the former Soviet Union, it seemed to me that the scenario of climate change there, in many of the scenarios, didn't really affect any explanation behind it for that specific area.
You're talking about these
Yeah, these ones.
the yields one.
They seem to be doing okay pretty much everywhere.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's look at the two cases. So in the case of maize, they do see negative impacts. But in the case of wheat and rice, it's both positive. I think those are quite different stories, actually. I mean, they are a significant producer of wheat. And so this probably represents a realistic, it might be an expansion in the area that's suitable, or it might just be even on existing area that with a longer growing season and so forth, that there's the potential for higher yields. Rice, I can't imagine there's a lot of rice produced in the Soviet Union. There must be a little bit maybe somewhere in Kazakhstan or something like that. But it's a smaller base and probably a less reliable estimate. But the general story is that the higher latitudes, there are many regions that could actually benefit if, and again, here's the big capital letter I, if the other things are in place. Just because the temperature gets a little bit more suitable doesn't mean that the infrastructure is in place or the policies are appropriate.
the
you know.
tradition, the culture is not there. Even they're saying Russia will be suitable for rice production in the summer eventually.
Mhm.
But I don't know.
Well, they say that England will be suitable for wine production.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they'll become good wine
They'll become
producers.
a wine
so.
producer.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in terms of the projection, use GCM model and plus crop model. So right now we have a lot of GCM models. We also have the ensemble results.
Mhm.
And also for the crop model, even for the rice or the maize or wheat. So each kind of the different crops, they have the many crop model in them. So that means is use a different model, you have a larger variation among models. So, sorry. So that means that, okay, what is most important for us? We want to understand the variation between the models, or we want to understand the difference